Biomedical research impact assessment is a complex discipline, or rather a set of disciplines of increasing interest and importance. It responds, as has been said, to the current need of researching on research, to create work teams prepared to work together, to analyze the mechanisms of the delay between research and its application, and to help meet medical research priorities so that they are carried out. In this talk, my goal is to show you from my professional profile as a clinician how the impact of biomedical research assessment awakens the interest of different types of institutions and professionals, and how these activities can target different objectives. The interest in impact assessment of politicians, sociologists, economists, managers, scientific societies, health professionals and citizens in general is not the same, and so is not the different type of knowledge that is sought from it. I have been a clinician all my life, although I have also played a certain role as a researcher, and am now in contact with the world of evaluation. My view of biomedical research impact assessment is certainly influenced by my position as a professional. That is, from my position as an end user of the research which I am together with the patient and citizen, rather than from being a researcher or a decision maker. I should perhaps start by saying what authority I have to give the talk. Not much. Perhaps my greatest credit is to have become actively interested in impact assessment after a long career as a clinician and as a researcher. Perhaps the way in which this interest began will be revealing. Although that was nearly 20 years ago, I was already a veteran clinician who had contributed to the consolidation of a large cardiology department in the Barcelona hospital. The importance of our research on pericardial disease was well known by then. In 1991, a book summarizing our studies was published in English. The international expert who had coordinated the translation wished us success in a personal letter. I was at first surprised. Success for what, since success had already been achieved by publishing the book? Then I realized that the relevance of research does not end with its publication. This obvious concept was alien to the culture of medical researchers to which I belonged, and I have never taken it into account before. For that culture, the ultimate goal of the research was to be published, possibly and even better if the publication was in high-impact journals. I had not acknowledged the consequences resulting from my research, failing to realize they were my responsibility as well. Perhaps this state of opinion still exists in layers of the medical and scientific community, hence the need for courses such as this one and its contents. May these words serve as tribute to the figure of Arnold Relman, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who died in 2014, who, by the same time that I had discovered that the importance of research does not end with its publication, had already announced the era of assessment and accountability as the third medical revolution since the Second World War. Two concepts, assessment and accountability, that are key to the study of the research impact. The two previous revolutions had been, according to Relman, the era of expansion of clinical practice and the era of cost containment. The need to evaluate what is being done and to identify the public accountability of the research process has not stopped growing since the day when Arnold Relman proclaimed the importance of these notions. To understand this process in its right measure, we must first have a clear idea of the context in which research is conducted. And to help define this framework, I would like to highlight three concepts. The first concept is what I call the double phase of research. I see research as a delicate flower that is half wild and half cultivated, that only grows well if two influences converge from opposite directions. On the one hand, activities for the promotion, management, or development of programs aimed to meet knowledge needs. It is a top-to-bottom influence. From activities of government agencies or from management to the researcher. On the other hand, the free activity and initiative of researchers, which are dependent on their personality and profile, experience and personal career trajectory, all of which is necessary for creative work. It is a bottom-to-top influence. Often, people who are active in each of these areas, managers or researchers, believe that only their view or position ensures the attainment of relevant research. Many researchers claim total freedom for their creative work, arguing that any type of management constriction or control puts a lock to their work, reminding us of the true fact that most major advances in our understanding of health and disease have precisely occurred as a result from such freedom. On the other hand, and also rightly so, many managers recall that the fully unrestricted activity of the research community without prioritization, development or management actions fails to meet the need for knowledge of society. That is, self-management of science is not enough. Moreover, the limitation of available resources does not allow for a waste of energy to gain knowledge that may perhaps not be as relevant. My opinion is that without coordination of both attitudes, it is not possible to obtain research of quality that generates valid and not redundant knowledge, and that simultaneously meet the needs for practical knowledge of society. I also think that there is insufficient legislation to address this problem. Some of the tensions and dilemmas raised by the judicious assessment of the social impact of research are based on this fact. Here is therefore some more food for thought for you. The second concept I want to stress about biomedical research is about its motivation. It is classic to recognize that research can be motivated by curiosity, that is, the simple desire to gain knowledge, or by the recognition of social needs that need to be met. Maybe it is often due to a combination of both factors. I think that in today's world, other powerful motivations should be considered to understand the global phenomenon of research. One is the meritocratic pressure or the need for personal prestige to meet the promotional goals of one's professional career. The strong pressure to do research in Western societies is well known, with its classic motto of publish or perish. To demonstrate the weight that this motivation has in some societies, I will stress that in my country, and I am afraid that in many other Western societies, a basic element in the assessment of a medical professional's curriculum for a position of responsibility in healthcare is the number and quality of research publications the applicant has. This is an evident paradox of no easy solution. And finally, a motivation of vital importance in today's world of research is economic profit. More than half the volume of current biomedical research is carried out by multinational pharmaceutical companies, biotechs or companies that manufacture medical devices, whose main objective is profit, although this may not exclude by any means other values. This is shown in the graph on the slide, somewhat old, but the contents of which remain rather unchanged. It is a fundamental fact that should not be forgotten. It is not in the intent of this course to address the much debated issue of the quality of that research, its potential abuse, or the great persuasive power of these industries to influence more and more academic groups and health professionals with their concepts. Further still, the modeling of academic and healthcare mindset is undoubtedly a social impact of first magnitude of the type of dominant research today, resulting from the collaboration of academia and the world market. That is why it is striking that much of the current core of studies on the social impact of research is circumscribed to publicly funded research or research funded by philanthropic organizations, excluding research funded by multinational companies with or without collusion with the academia. The target audiences of impact assessment studies are usually public research managers, and many of these studies are owed to the need to select projects to be funded according to their expected impact. Hence, the activities of social impact assessment do not focus on research sponsored by the industry. As a result, from the point of view of the end user of medical research, healthcare professional or citizen, a notable impact of research on medical practice with consequences for health and society comes from research conducted to make a profit, and this type of research is hardly taken into account precisely in standard studies conducted to seek out impact. I recognize that situations are not always clear-cut, and that the boundaries between public and private sector are becoming increasingly blurred. But what I depict here is another issue for the consideration by all of us. A set of social forces, including the meritocratic pressure to publish and a great deal of research promoted by the industry, has led, especially in affluent societies, to an exorbitant proliferation of scientific literature. Much of this scientific production may be redundant, futile, or even openly invalid. An article published in Lancet in 2009 that raised much debate proposed the application of 4 quality criteria to research. First, relevance of the research question for its users, questions relevant to clinicians and patients. 2, that design and methods were appropriate. 3, that the study as a whole, and not just part of it, was accessible and transparent, accessible full publication. And 4, that the publication was fully unbiased and applicable to reality. The authors estimated that by applying this criteria, as much as 85% of the currently published work, whether basic or clinical research, much of it promoted not only by the industry, but also by academic organizations, was futile or redundant. In plain terms, it was waste. The proliferation of redundant or futile research is a social evil. By contrast, quality medical research is becoming increasingly necessary to address the health challenges of today's world. These challenges have to be identified, and a consistent research policy has to be developed. 20 years ago, Douglas Altman wrote a memorable statement in an opinion article in the British Medical Journal. We need less research, since he was of the opinion that in the UK pure quality research driven by self-promotion was proliferating, better research, and research that is conducted for the right reasons. The meaning of Altman's reflection 20 years later remains current and as appropriate as it was then. Good research, on the other hand, promotes as a stimulus or example new research activities. This is called absorptive capacity of research, which attracts or absorbs more practice. All these considerations are particularly relevant for low or middle income countries like ours, where research needs may differ from those of richer countries that in a way set the international agenda. In recent times, researchers and managers are increasingly provided with further tools to prevent futility, such as reported in the articles shown on the slide, that corresponds to a series published in Lancet in 2014. The knowledge or estimation of the likely social impact of a project is one of the elements that can improve its prioritization and help prevent futile research. The last concept related to the research process I want to emphasize is what I call the evolution of the social patterns of its practice. Several sociologists have highlighted the two models in the history of research that have received various denominations. According to the classical model, the so-called academic science perspective, the researcher seeks knowledge as an aim in itself, acting on his or her own initiative, and is valued within the scientific community through peer review or equivalent mechanisms. According to this model, the researcher is autonomous, and science is a self-organized activity, its product being public and universal. According to the model called post-academic, research is commissioned by a public or private organization which holds the ownership and control of its product. The researcher's position is governed according to social, organizational, or corporate criteria. This fact is not surprising in a world in which research is a great source of wealth. Naturally, these models are not rigidly separated in reality, nor have they appeared in strict temporal sequence. But it could probably be said that in today's world, research is increasingly conformant to the characteristics of the latter. This entails a change in the traditional values of scientific activity, values that are increasingly dominated by dependence on public or private organizations and more distant from universalism and the so-called communalism of classical science. These three concepts, the double phase of research, its motivations, and its social patterns, allow to better understand how research impact assessment is conducted and for what purposes. The key feature of biomedical research impact assessment is perhaps its heterogeneity. This heterogeneity affects the existence of different types of impact, its nomenclature, and the methodology used for its measurement, the different functions implicit to the assessment itself and its purposes and target audiences. Many of the issues relating to the methodology for assessment of the different type of impacts will be covered in this course. In my talk, I will just be making some other comments about other types of heterogeneity. The heterogeneity of the different types of impact is well illustrated by two examples that I know well, as they are research projects in which I have played a particularly active role. The first project, or group of studies related to the methodology of etiological diagnosis in acute pericardial disease. This project established a validated methodology for the diagnosis of these diseases, generated a considerable number of international publications in high-impact factor journals, and reached a significant number of citations in the literature. Its contents were collected in recognized international expert reviews on the subject. A regionally conducted survey revealed the widespread acceptance of the diagnostic methodology yielded by the study in different hospitals, although the possible more extensive dissemination of such methodology was not studied. It was assumed that the adoption of this pattern resulted in a more adequate management of the disease that provided benefit to the patients. However, this assumption was not objectively verified either. Thus, the health impact of such scientifically valuable project is hardly ascertainable. The second project referred to the determinants of in-hospital mortality in coronary surgery. The articles describing the results of this project were of modest scientific impact and were cited less often. However, in the years following the completion of the project, an approximate 50% reduction in in-hospital mortality was observed following coronary surgery in the participating hospitals, without changing the severity of operated patients. Several data suggest that the study resulted in corrective measures being taken, such as modifications in the surgical teams, thus being one of the factors that led to improved outcomes of cardiac surgery in our area. Both projects, the one on pericardial disease and the one on coronary surgery, generated further studies with a modest effect on the development of new research professional careers. However, in comparing both groups, it becomes clear that the types of impact produced by each one are different. Their representation in spider diagrams, a graph in which each axis represents a different type of impact to which a conventional score is assigned, shows how the profile of the impacts obtained in each of the two projects differs from each other. Not only are the profiles different, but also scarcely commensurable. It makes little sense to discuss which of the two effects is more important: to spread throughout the world a methodology for a more efficient diagnosis of an only occasionally serious illness, or to contribute locally to reducing the mortality of major surgery. Another type of heterogeneity of the social impact assessment of biomedical research may be understood if the multiple functions, even the duties which society in general has regarding research, are taken into account. If we stop to think about these functions, their number and variety is rather striking. For example, society should categorize the needs for knowledge in health and their relative priority, contribute to establishing valid research programs, avoiding futility and redundancy, enable the dissemination of quality pure knowledge and ensure that the needs for applied knowledge are met, incentivize the production of valid and not redundant or futile knowledge, identify and stimulate the pathways through which knowledge obtained in research is applied for health improvement, and identify the spectrum of effects of such application on health and society in general, so as to enhance debate and interaction. In the utilization of each and every one of the elements of this wide range of functions, assessing the social impact of research can play a more or less prominent role. Perhaps this variety becomes even more evident if these functions are translated to the questions that the evaluator of the research impact may want to respond. There are multiple questions in this regard. No evaluation study has the power to respond to all questions. No study can be, so to speak, global. The questions that each study raises and the type of knowledge produced shall be consistent with the aims of the study itself and the approach used by the study authors. The study will seek to simply respond to just one or several of the multiple following questions. What are the criteria for programming research across institutions and societies? How should the preferences of the several funding agents be established? When and how should the free initiative of the researcher predominate? What are the user's roles? How can estimation of the likely impact of research help promote or prioritize projects? How can the knowledge of mechanisms of research impact generation be used for their facilitation and enhancement? What is the net value of new knowledge? Who are its potential beneficiaries? What methods should be used to assess global economic and health benefits of research? How should such assessments be interpreted, and to whom are they useful? How can or how should the impact of research on real-world healthcare practice be measured? Can such knowledge improve the quality of healthcare? This course will provide responses to some of these questions. The objective of my presentation is not to give you a specific answer to any of these questions, but rather to illustrate how the profile of each different target audience to whom assessment is aimed will determine the various questions and answers. We can ask ourselves who is interested in research impact assessment and who its target audiences are. The influences of two social orders converge on the researcher. First, the different managers, planners, politicians, economists, companies, and organization executive officers. These are the groups or individuals situated upstream, that is, in positions of power in the research process. Economic beneficiaries could also partly be placed here. In short, they are people or groups that promote or regulate the process. Health professionals, patients, and the general public are situated downstream. They are the end users of the research product. All of them may be interested in studying research impact. The nature of the different studies performed will unveil the interests and objectives of some of these groups, and we can speculate that the nature of the research will be related to the historical circumstances, values, and benefits of each time and place. This point can be illustrated by reviewing 3 studies assessing the impact of research and seeing how the characteristics of the study correspond to the type of target audience to which it is addressed. The first study that I am going to discuss is a recent, from 2014, study on the estimated profit or returns of cancer-related research in the UK in terms of net monetary value of clinical outcomes carried out by RAND Europe and London King's College. The study methodology is sophisticated and complex. The benefit in terms of money generated by the public and philanthropic investment made in research was estimated using different assumptions from the clinical results yielded by the implementation of research. In this study, bottom-up dynamics were employed. That is, first the different types of studies were identified, and then the clinical benefits from their implementation were estimated by assigning a monetary value based on quality-adjusted life years or QALYs that such application might have generated. The costs of public and philanthropic investment in research between 1970 and 2009 were identified. These costs were grouped in 7 areas according to whether they were therapeutic studies in cancers with the highest prevalence, screening or smoking cessation. Net monetary benefits of the investment were calculated by first calculating the implementation rates of the research results using mainly NIH statistical data as reference, and then by estimating the quality-adjusted life years that had resulted from such implementation. Estimations were based on various existing studies on the effect of interventions on survival and quality of life, assigning the conventional value of £25,000 per quality-adjusted life year gained. In very general terms, the study concluded that with due caution in its interpretation, the ratio of internal payback or return on investment in research was 10%, being the largest proportion of that profit by far, attributable to research studies on smoking cessation. Different sensitivity analysis proved that all the results were plausible. The main message of this complex study was to establish that, assessed as a whole, investment in cancer research generated a significant economic benefit. This message was intended for large investors in that research, the state and charities, and assured them an overall profitability of their operations. The benefit of specific projects or other types of impact other than monetary value was not analyzed at all. At a historical time when the economic sustainability of certain public initiatives can be questioned, a study such as this one provides evidence in favor of their viability and helps justify their continuation. Perhaps if the notion that research may be a good investment became the main reason to justify it, this would illustrate the values that prevail in today's world. The second study I am going to discuss to illustrate how the target audiences of a study are associated with its methodology and purpose was also conducted in the UK and also by members of RAND Europe and Brunel University. The study in question analyzed the various types of social impacts on research on arthritis, grouping them together as exhaustively as possible, and was made possible thanks to the funding provided by the Arthritis Research Campaign, ARC, a leading charity in the UK. The organisation had commissioned RAND Europe to carry out an assessment study to determine the extent to which the grants it had given had produced a social impact. In other words, the ARC wanted to know what types of social outcomes had been generated by the money they had invested in research grants, and the feature of the grants that had resulted most productive. In part, this initiative had emerged from the social demand for a suspicion that, I quote, "there seems to be a gap between the aspirations of people affected by arthritis and the ability of science and academia to meet those aspirations." ARC's request sought to fill this gap, in addition to seeking criteria on the social efficiency of its activities. The work performed by RAND Europe has already become a benchmark in this type of studies and has set some influential methodological guidelines, a large part of which will be the subject of study in this course. In the study, in reality a series of studies, research grants awarded by the ARC were selected and subjected to assessment. Subsequent to the initial projects, a complex evaluation method was developed to analyze 136 grants for projects completed in 2002 and 2006. This model was based on the technique called case study, which incorporates qualitative research methodology, interviews with researchers, expert assessment, and statistical analysis. A method called RAISE for the identification and categorization of various types of impact was also developed. It is not my intention here to discuss in detail the complex categorization of the types of impacts observed, but I believe it is important to point out that they encompass a wide variety of impacts, not only the economic benefits sought after in the study I mentioned earlier. The types of impacts identified in this study correspond to the payback model that you are already familiar with and include, among others, scientific publications, postgraduate education, careers generated by projects, influence on subsequent studies, transfer of technology, contribution to clinical practice guidelines, influence on medical practice, clear identification of health benefits and potential economic benefits. What features of the grants that were associated with a larger number of types of impacts and their relevance were also identified. In this way, individuals responsible for the allocation of funds in the charity were able to have at their disposal for subsequent calls the tools necessary to allocate the money, prioritizing projects in the way that was considered most efficient or with the highest social output. It is worth mentioning that in this vision of research impact, health outcomes are just one more of the social effects that are taken into account to justify the investment. It is striking that in one of the analyses of the studies of ARC, it was considered that despite the wide array of types of impacts reached, only 2.5% of the research promoted by the organization resulted in diagnostic, therapeutic, or public health advances that were applied to practice. The mechanisms whereby these advances were developed, how the results of the research were transferred to practice, and what barriers and facilities were encountered to that end were not an objective of these studies. Beside possible health benefits, it is other types of impacts that allow the responsible officers of the organization to judge whether their investment is socially useful or not. ARC studies are thus an example of assessment based on ensuring the efficiency of project funding according to its expected global social impact. The target audiences of these studies are not, as in the previous examples, large investors, but the managers of a charity that handles a significant amount of funds. Moreover, the purpose of those target audiences has allowed the development of a system for categorizing the types of impacts of global interest. The third study I have chosen to illustrate how the target audiences of an impact assessment study are and the type of knowledge gained are closely associated corresponds to a systematic review of qualitative studies. It is not formally a study of impact assessment, since the impact is not directly the focus of attention. It does not analyze the economic benefits of research, nor its broad social impact, or how research can influence health policymakers. It stems from the other end of the process, focusing on which individual determinants influence health professionals, in this case nurses, to adopt or not adopt research findings into clinical practice. We must not forget that biomedical research exerts its effects in real life through these professionals, and their attitudes and behaviors will be important for the final impact on health. This study demonstrated that the most important determinant for nurses to adopt research findings into their practice was their positive attitude towards research in general. Other influencing factors were their academic qualifications, continuing education activities, and job satisfaction. Sociodemographic factors, and notably participation in research activities, did not influence nurses in this regard. All these findings could be taken into account in training activities to improve the impact of research in professional practice. Various studies of this type can be found in the literature, particularly relating to what characteristics of research projects have made health managers adopt the projects into clinical practice, and what attitudes or beliefs of managers were determinant to implement the adoption. They reflect an analysis of the impact of research from the point of view of the user, not from the point of view of the manager or funder, and show the transfer of knowledge into practice regardless of other types of economic or social impact. The three examples that I have shown illustrate an array of types of study and knowledge that depends on what type of recipient the analysis is aimed at: large investors, research managers, or health professionals. These examples also illustrate that, in very schematic terms, the assessment of impact can be carried out using two distinct approaches or aims, which I call regulatory approach and analytical approach. The regulatory approach includes studies that were performed in an attempt to respond to the question: what use has been made of the assigned resources by researchers and/or centers, with the ultimate aim of finding out how these resources should be redistributed or reassigned. This approach would correspond to the two studies undertaken by RAND Europe on cancer and arthritis that I mentioned above. By contrast, studies carried out using the analytical approach basically try to answer the question: what pathways are used to transfer research outcomes to society? The ultimate objective of studies in which this type of approach is used is to identify what should be done to enhance such transfer. Quoting what an expert in this type of evaluation said: whereas assessment of research impact are often used for accounting purposes, we propose to use assessment as a learning tool that helps us understand what goes on between researchers and stakeholders. Assessment can then result in recommendations for improvement in the interaction necessary for achieving social impact. The third of my examples on the attitude of nurses regarding the implementation of research outcomes into practice is consistent with this approach. For a clinician as I am, the analytical approach is extremely attractive. And I want to emphasize that it strikes me that because most studies on impact assessment are aimed at the management activities, investment, accountability, priority setting, and resource allocation, this analytical approach is relatively less common in the research works performed. For instance, remember that the conceptual model of payback prepared by Buxton and Haney, based on economic theory, outlines the research process and the production of impact in three phases: identification of research topic, research itself with its primary products, and development and adoption or transfer to society. What is most striking from much of the current literature and from the interest in evaluating the impact of research is that in this entire process, many studies focus primarily on the search and description of immediate and intermediate impacts and their predictors. The model does not consider the motivations and determinants involved in the choice of research topics. The red ellipse to the left of the slide, which I have already mentioned to be strongly related to the forces that move our society. What is relevant to my point is that many experts who use this model seem to assume that the stages of adoption of research findings by society and their ultimate impacts, the red ellipses that I have indicated on the right side of the slide, are simple and linear. You could almost affirm that some authors fully assume that this process occurs automatically without special complexities. This specific stage, which has been called knowledge transfer, is very complex and particularly important for end users of research, may they be professionals, patients, or members of the general population. It is on this stage where the interest of the studies that I have described as based on an analytical approach partly focuses. However, the current interest in the discipline of impact assessment may be highly driven by regulatory motivations and the social stakeholders involved in these motivations. For example, in some studies, it seems to be assumed that a research finding that has led to an innovation or recommendation is implemented into practice when it has been incorporated into the contents of a clinical practice guideline. As I said, these studies seem to assume that going from publication to inclusion in clinical practice guidelines and from that into clinical practice is linear, and that the production of benefit is linear as well. Certainly, it is not easy to assess what happens in real life, but it is much more complicated than that. There is no linear transfer, but a labyrinth or maze of influences and routes of transmission. The inclusion in a clinical practice guideline continues to be an intermediate variable between the publication of a research result and its application into actual practice. The application into actual practice can be reached by going or not through this intermediate variable with the interaction of often powerful multiple factors: the influence of academia, industry, scientific societies, cultural habits, personal initiatives, the oral transfer of knowledge, and imponderable factors, not to mention the concomitant effect of existing knowledge on other studies. Indeed, authors who favor an analytical approach to research impact assessment advocate the search of productive interactions, which consist of contacts and exchanges, sometimes unexpected, between researchers and different social agents, leading to the dissemination and implementation of innovations. In addition, finding out what health benefits or losses are attributable to a specific advance in research, once it has been applied to practice, is even more difficult. Some authors think that the number of medical, environmental, social, and imponderable factors influencing a health status is so large that it is almost futile to attribute such health status to a particular factor, such as a research advance. Other authors, such as those from the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, emphasize the need and the lack of adequate indicators to express health benefits in studies seeking to assess the impact of research. By contrast, we have seen, as exemplified by the British study on cancer, that other authors act as if this was not so, and even dare to give a monetary value to the life years gained from research. The complexity of these issues is therefore evident. I am not trying to say that there is no literature on the stages mediating between communication of research findings and their adoption into practice. The literature on the subject is abundant. For example, special emphasis has been placed on the study of the factors that determine the time between conducting research and application of its results, which as a rule takes years. This last January 2015, a new conceptual model to analyze this delay was just proposed. There is also an abundance of studies on compliance with clinical practice guidelines, on the influence of medical literature on clinical practice, or on its determinants. Nevertheless, most of these studies have shown only weak associations between professional behavior and determinants thereof. There is therefore much to be learned and much to be improved upon. What I wish to emphasize is that this phase, the way in which knowledge flows from the communication of research to how it affects the end user, whether professional, patient, or simply a citizen, has not yet been well or fully incorporated into main studies addressing research impact assessment. These studies, as I emphasized earlier, are basically aimed at the world of research management and the economic investment that is made in research. The research community itself is not a preferred object of studies assessing impact, except for, and in a low volume, studies on public health policies. Undoubtedly, the values, preferences, and social dynamics of the research community play a role in the social impact of research, a role that should be better analyzed. I have had, in my capacity as a clinical researcher, a modest experience of what this role in the last decades of my career means. And also in relation to the end users of research, I want to mention that so far, the role of the opinions of patients and that of the general public has been widely disregarded, both when assessing the impact of research and when prioritizing research topics. An illustrative example of the possible significance of this view is shown by a study published in 2013 in which the priorities of an association of patients, the James Lindelians, were compared in the column of the left with the priorities of non-commercial clinical trials in the center and commercial clinical trials on the right. Topics such as education, healthcare, diet, exercise, and psychological and behavioral interventions accounted for nearly 60% of patients' priorities, but did not even reach 5% in commercial clinical trials. About 85% of commercial clinical trials studied drugs, vaccines, or biological products, and that corresponded barely with 20% of the patient's priorities. Whichever way it is interpreted, certainly this disparity cannot continue to be ignored. As a summary of everything I have said here, and as a conclusion of my presentation, I would like to make the following considerations. Biomedical research impact assessment is a very complex and heterogeneous discipline that has become increasingly important because of some features of the research process itself, its varied motivations or incentives, the enormous growth of current scientific production, which has variable applicability, quality, and validity, its complicated role in social dynamics, its huge consumption of material and human resources, and its tangled journey to positive and negative effects on human health and welfare. The heterogeneity of impact assessment affects its objectives and methods. This heterogeneity depends on the variety of types of research impact, but it also largely depends on the purpose for which assessment is performed and the social groups interested in it. The bulk of the studies conducted to date have been directed to investors and managers of various kinds, as these studies may be useful for a better allocation of material resources and better prioritization of projects. The paradox is that one of the modes of research with the greatest impact on society and human health, that conducted for profit by the industry, so far has been the subject of comparatively less attention in the types of studies being discussed here than publicly or charity-funded research. The routes used for the transfer of knowledge are extremely complex, from production to end users, whether professionals, patients, or the general population, and are still insufficiently studied. This fact is related to the more regulatory rather than analytical purpose of the dominant trend of thought that is preferably focused on the efficient allocation of resources. With the ultimate goal of efficiently maximizing the welfare of citizens, research impact assessment should, in my view, move evenly in three directions. First, contributing on the basis of the anticipated impact to prioritize research projects that satisfy social needs without increasing intellectual waste. Second, fostering demand for specific research lines by stakeholders involved in its implementation, the role that some authors call pull. The preferences of society should be one way or another incorporated into this process. And finally, achieving a better knowledge of the determinants and mechanisms of an effective knowledge transfer to healthcare practice, so that such transfer is stimulated and fostered, what these authors call push function. To summarize my presentation, I will briefly state that the principal and complementary questions that research impact assessment can and must respond to in order to equitably meet the needs of all potential end users are: what criteria may be useful to select and prioritize research projects that may result in social benefit? What are the mechanisms and pathways whereby research findings are incorporated into practice, and how can they be enhanced? What are the mechanisms and pathways whereby such incorporation of findings results in better health? Can they really be known? And finally, how should they be enhanced? Thank you very much for your attention.